Well, this passage is a fantastic passage, and a passage which people read and think, oh yeah, well that's a nice little story. But it is so pivotal in the whole of the Scriptures for your understanding of the future, of your understanding of passages about the end times in the book of Revelation, in the book of Ezekiel, in the book of Zechariah, in the book of Isaiah. And it is pivotal in your understanding of the whole of Scriptures and putting it together, right from the book of Genesis in chapter 11, where the Tower of Babel was commenced and built by Nimrod. And Nimrod decided to get people to build this big place, this big city in the land of Shinar, which is Babylon, which is Iraq. It's by the Euphrates River. And he tried to build this monument to humanity to actually reach God and to actually fight God. That's how arrogant Nimrod was. And from the beginnings of Nimrod and the beginnings of the Babylonian Empire, right there with Nimrod, God has frustrated their works of trying to reach the heavens, or supposedly reach the heavens, and supposedly bringing people against God right from that time. Here we have a story of Nebuchadnezzar in the history of where Babylon was in 300, well, in the 1400s. And here's where he's there. Remember in chapter 2, he's had the dream that he is the head of gold in this image that he dreamed of, that Daniel interpreted. He was the gold, he was the head. And then you had the silver and the bronze and the iron mixed with clay in the different kingdoms that was to come after King Nebuchadnezzar. So you have him on top as the sort of the echelon of all the kingdoms which were to come down from him. And then in the book of Revelation, we have the Babylon that is fallen, the Babylon that is judged, the Babylon that has become the great city from the time that Nimrod started to build it. It's a spiritual city, it's a spiritual thing, but the thing is, it encompasses the whole world, and God puts the whole world into this slot of Babylon. And from that time that Babylon is judged, and God says, Babylon, the great Babylon, has fallen. Babylon is judged, in other words, and there is a time when Babylon, in the end, will fall, and that Christ comes down, judges the world, and brings his saints to be with him, to be in the city of Jerusalem that comes out of heaven, that's created by Christ. So it puts it all together right here in this chapter. A lot of people read it, and it's something that needs to be brought into your thinking when you read this chapter, because it can just be a pleasant little story if you miss some of these other things. So in this passage this morning, I want to talk about three main points. First of all, we want to look at the problem of ease, or the danger of ease, comfort, in other words. Secondly, we want to look at the danger of pride, and then look at the beauty of humility, or the strength of humility. So first of all, we need to know that King Nebuchadnezzar was at a time of ease, and that he thought he was pretty good. He thought he was the best. In fact, we'll go through the passage and find out that he did think himself as the best. But Nebuchadnezzar, as a wicked king, needed to learn who was boss. Even though he thought he was the boss, God ultimately had to show him who was boss. I remember a story that I got told about the king of the jungle. It was Mr. Lion. And Mr. Lion was walking through the jungle one day. It's a fictitious story, by the way, if you're just wondering. Because sometimes people think that pastors tell all these truthful stories, which they should, but they need to tell them when that's fictional, because some people believe them, you see. But Mr. Lion was walking through the jungle one day, and he was thinking, how good am I? I'm the king of the castle. I'm the king of the jungle. And there is no one like me. There is no one that is as strong as me. There is no one that has the pride of me. Because I've got a beautiful mane. I am beautiful. I am absolutely wonderfully made. I'm a beauty of creation. And he thought, I'm going to walk through my jungle today and I'm going to see and make sure that I'm boss, but I'm going to hear from other people who is he. So he walks through the jungle and he starts walking and walking and he comes up to little monkey and he says, "Row, monkey, who is the king of the jungle?" And the monkey in petrification, he's shivering at his boots. He says, "Why, you are Mr. Lion, you are the king of the jungle." And he goes, "Row," and he walks on, strutting his stuff with his mane flicking out as he walks along, you know, as lions do. And he came to Mr. Antelope. And Mr. Antelope was there before the lion. The lion could have swiped him with one swoop, and he says to the antelope, "Mr. Antelope, why, who is the king of the jungle?" And Mr. Antelope says, well, you are, Mr. King. You are the king. You are the king of the jungle." And he goes, "Row," lets out a big roar and walks on. And then he comes to the elephant. And he comes to the elephant and he goes, "Why, Mr. Elephant, who is the king of the jungle?" And with that, elephant picked him up by the mane, bounced him on the ground, threw him around a few times, and then threw him into the nearby lake. Well, with that, Mr. Lion had to sort of get himself out of the lake. He was all wet and shook himself, came up to the elephant and said, "Just because you don't know the answer, there's no need to get upset about it." Nebuchadnezzar needed to learn who was boss here. He needed to learn that there was a king in the heavens who was ruling mankind and was in charge, and that God had actually given him the rule that he is about. So, with that introduction, let's move into the passage. And we'll read some of the verses as we go. But let's begin in verse 1. "Nebuchadnezzar the king to all peoples, nations and languages that dwell in all the earth." Now there's a cuneiform clay tablet that was found in Babylon, in the area of Babylon, and it said, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, give you a message to all the nations and the world." But then it stops, and we don't have the rest of that clay tablet. Here we have a message from Nebuchadnezzar telling the world about what God has done for him. This was a message for all of mankind for all time. This was really a message from Nebuchadnezzar to the world, showing what God had done for him. He's speaking to all people, nations and languages that dwell on the earth. Now, the rule of Babylon, the rule of Babylon was not just around the area of Iraq, but it went right to the bottom of what we know as Arabia. It went down to Egypt, it went to Judea, Phoenicia, and to Syria and Assyria, and the rule was there. Probably to the north part of India and part of the bottom part of Turkey and maybe bottom part of Russia to the Caspian Sea. But it was limited. But to him, that was the ends of the earth. But now he has a message through the scriptures that Daniel has put in place here that goes to all people, all nations, to the ends of the earth, what God has done. And then he says, "Peace be multiplied to you." Now that was just a normal greeting back in those days. We have the greeting of the Romans, or the Jews, which was shalom, in other words, peace to you. But here was a greeting, peace be multiplied to you. Peter in chapter 1 verse 2 says, grace and peace be multiplied to you. He's bringing together the aspect of grace and peace, whereas King Nebuchadnezzar just has peace be multiplied to you. Peter is thinking of something spiritual, not only that there's the grace that comes from Jesus Christ, but the peace that comes through knowing forgiveness of sins, that grace and peace be multiplied to you. Nebuchadnezzar can't give you that peace, but that's what he says. Peace be multiplied to you. Just a bit of a pleasantry. And he says, I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. In one version it says, it is my pleasure to announce to you. You know, as though, oh, here I am. It's my pleasure to announce to you what has happened to me. And he goes on to give the account right here of what has happened to him in this part of his reign. Whether this, some say that this is in about the 17th year of his reign. He reigned for about 42 years. So Daniel's probably about the age of 30. And Nebuchadnezzar's in his 17th year of reign. And then he goes on to say, I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom and his dominion is from generation to generation. In chapter 3, we have him building himself an idol and getting people from around the nations to actually come and worship that idol that he made out of gold. Remember, it was 60 cubits by 6 cubits, representing the fallen humanity, representing something that was short of God. And we get, where we get the 666 in the book of Revelation in chapter 13. But here he is, and he's giving the address to the people, to the nations, and he's saying these signs and wonders happened. And then he goes on to say that his dominion is from generation to generation. So from one aspect in the previous chapter, that's what I was going to say. The previous chapter, he's thinking about worship and the worship of himself, but here he actually has to acknowledge that there is a God and that there is a great God, the God of Daniel, even though he's still a bit synchronistic. In other words, he tries to synchronise the other gods into his own mind. He goes on, verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. Powerful sort of verse here. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. This speaks volumes because Nebuchadnezzar had trounced all the kingdoms around him. He had destroyed Egypt, basically. He had destroyed Judea. He had destroyed Jerusalem totally and taken all the wealth out of Jerusalem. He had destroyed Tyre and lots of parts of Phoenicia, which is on the coast from Israel. He had destroyed Assyria. He had destroyed Syria. And he had taken the booty of war and all the gold that was in all of those kingdoms. He has had a fantastic building program that has gone on for years, and he has built a big temple. Built a big temple to Marduk, which was meant to be this fantastic temple. He's built himself a house. He's built himself a fortress, and he's at the stage of complacency, and he's just saying, "I'm at rest now. I can take ease." And it says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace." I was flourishing. Babylon was known for its hanging gardens. And what he did in his palace, he actually had these gardens that hung and were made to actually hang over the palace to keep it cool during the heat of the day. If you know Iraq, you can get 50-degree days, and that's quite a normal day in the middle of summer. Ask the soldiers about that. But it was quite a place as far as the majesty of Babylon was concerned. He was at rest. He was flourishing in his palace. Which brings us to the point of the dangers of ease, the dangers of comfort. And what I mean by that is that the Lord has lots to say about being at ease in one's life. From the very beginning in the scriptures, when Israel was at ease, we can go to lots of different passages, but just a few today. When Israel was taken out of Egypt and brought into the land of Canaan, they were to fight all their enemies. They were not to rest on their laurels until all the enemies had been defeated. There were a few tribes that rested on their laurels, put their feet up and thought, we don't need to do this. We don't need to go and get those enemies up at Dan, which are the top part of Israel. And Dan became complacent. They sat down, put their feet up and said, we're not going to fight these people. And there were tribes in Israel that just didn't want to fight and destroy their enemies. And I could understand one part where the king in the area of Og, where the king of Og lived, who was one of the last of the giants. Now he was, get this, his bed was 9 metres tall. And they believed that he was just shy of 9 metres tall. Now, we've got a tall lad here, but this makes Goliath look like a shrimp. There were still giants in the land. And there were some tall people, from the sons of Anak, which are mentioned in the scriptures. And they've found quite a lot of archaeological evidence about people that are over 15 feet tall and even up to 20 feet tall. This is hard to imagine, but it's there in the scriptures, the lands of the giants. Remember, the spies came back and they said that we were like grasshoppers in their sight. Remember that? They were like grasshoppers. And I was just I measured it out with my boys, with two of my boys and Amy the other night. And it was pretty high, like 14 feet. It was probably near the ceiling up here, to there. So it's like you being up to here on me. And that's how tall they were. So you can understand why they didn't want to go and fight these people. Couldn't you? But God said that they weren't to rest, that he was in charge and that he would help them no matter where they went to fight. And remember Caleb and Joshua saying, yeah, we can defeat them with our God. But they rested and God was angry at them. There's passages in Amos chapter 6, which talks about Israel being at ease. And he says, woe to you who are at ease in Zion. What was happening? They were resting on their laurels. They were resting in their own works, in their own circumstances, and they weren't about the business of doing things for God and with God. We can talk about David up there on the top of his house when he was meant to be at war and he's resting, thinking, oh, no, I don't need to go out. I don't need to go out for war. They can fight their own battles. And then he has that sin against Bathsheba. He was at ease. Most of his enemies had been conquered and he was just at ease, complacent. There's lots of scriptures that we could build up and multiply. Read from Zechariah chapter 1 verse 14. So the angel who talked with me said to me, cry out, thus says the Lord of hosts, I am exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion, and I am exceedingly angry with the nations that are at ease. For while I was angry but a little, they furthered the disaster. Therefore thus says the Lord, I have returned to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it, declares the Lord of hosts, and the measuring line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. See, what was happening there was that Israel was too busy building their own houses and too busy feathering their own nests rather than building the temple and getting involved in the building of the temple. When we come to the New Testament, we find the Christians at ease in Jerusalem. We find that they were there and they were meant to be bringing the gospel into all the world, starting at Jerusalem, Samaria, Judea, and the rest of the world. But what had happened was that the Christians were a little bit settled in their ways, and God had to bring them persecution to actually then send them out Interesting thing. And when we go through the history of the church, we see this pendulum swinging between comfort and God starting to work and people getting involved in what God is doing and being about the business of evangelism and seeing other people come to know the Lord. See, what happens in times of revival is that God does works that are just fantastic, that sees many people come to know the Lord in a very short time. If you go to the history of Wales, you'll find that the Welsh revival in 1917, people flocked to the churches. There were so many people in the churches all at once within a few weeks that all the churches, whether they were Catholic, Presbyterian, whether they were Baptist, whether they were Calathumpian, whatever, were totally filled to the brink, whereby one of the pastors couldn't get through to the front of the church. He had to walk on the shoulders of the men to the front of the church from all these people that were flocking to the churches. Then what happens is that people come out of the ranks of humanity, come to know the Lord. They start saving their money because instead of gambling and spending on booze and doing all sorts of other things. And then the church becomes wealthy. And then the church becomes complacent in their evangelism and starts to dwindle and starts to die in the ways and the numbers are concerned. The whole history of the church is a bit like that. It's like this pendulum swinging. It's a bit like that for Israel as well, where God seems to do a great work and then people get complacent. People start to get at ease in the churches. Now, for us to get ease, to get to the point of ease in our own life, in our own church life, in our own denominational life, in our own national life, is a disaster. You know, we live in a latte culture. We live in a sort of a culture where we want to have ease. We want to have comfort. We want to have the comforts of life. But God has lots of words about riches and comforts in this life. That in your comforts, I wasn't planning on saying this, but in your comforts and your growth in your wealth, it's easy to forget God. God said that to the people of Israel in Deuteronomy. He said, in your blessing, in your prosperity, don't forget the Lord and His ways. Lots of dangers, lots of things we need to work through in our own life, in the way that we spend money, in the ways that we think that we have to have comfort. We have to go and see this movie. We have to go and see that movie. We've got to keep up with the Joneses. We've got to do this and that instead of what the Lord wants in our life. Being involved in the evangelism, being in the process of the church, of building the church. Just like the people of Israel, they didn't want to build the temple. They wanted to be building themselves. God said, no, build the temple. And that's where that verse from Zechariah comes, about people of Israel being at ease, or people in Jerusalem being at ease. And the verses in Amos too, about woe to you who are at ease in Zion, mouth of a fiery preacher, who came across and said, this is what God says. Woe to you who are at ease. He's the same prophet that went and prophesied to the women of Bashan and said, you cows of Bashan. Imagine go to a church today and saying, you know, to the women, hey, you women, you're like the cows of Bashan. You're like cows of Adelaide. But he was that kind of prophet, speaking what God had said. So, that's a bit about ease, the danger of ease, danger of complacency. Even Laodicea was complacent and called the lukewarm church. They were a very wealthy church, but God said that they were poor, pitiable, blind and naked before Him. They didn't even know Him. They weren't even walking with Him, and Christ was standing outside of the church. This is a church that's been saved, a church that is meant to be working with God and in God and knowing God, and yet Christ is outside the church knocking on the door. It's like Christ being at the door and doing this tap in front of the church. Lukewarm. That's what Laodicea was like. So, let's move on. Therefore, I issued a decree verse 5, I saw a dream which made me afraid. You know about kings of those days, if they had dreams and weren't able to understand them, it used to make them very afraid because they weren't sure whether it was talking about them, their enemies, what was going to happen to them. They were very superstitious. And the thoughts of my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, actually translated scholars in the Hebrew, the astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers came in and told them, and I told them the dream. But they did not make known to me its interpretation. Remember in chapter 2 we had a dream of Nebuchadnezzar that he couldn't remember, but he told the astrologers, the soothsayers, the Chaldeans and the wise men to interpret, even though he couldn't tell them the dream, but they were to tell him the dream and the interpretation. Here he actually has the dream, and he gives the dream to these men, but they still can't interpret the dream. But, that big but, verse 8, but at last there was a man. There was a man that could interpret my dream. Who was he? Daniel. And Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar in brackets here. According to the name of my God, in him is the spirit of the holy gods. That's really what the translation is. Spirit of the holy gods. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar recognised that he was a man and there was something holy in this man, and that he was one that could interpret dreams, and he could actually have this understanding that the others did not have. We would call it the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit was active in him. But for Nebuchadnezzar, it was just the Spirit of the Holy God. Somehow I recognise him as a holy man, as having some spirits of gods, because he only thinks in God's terms, you know, gods, plural. But somehow he recognised that the Spirit of the Holy God is in him. And I told him the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, or scholars, because I know that the Spirit of the Holy God is in you and no secret troubles you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. And then Nebuchadnezzar gives him the dream, gives Daniel the dream, and I'll read it. These were the visions of my head while on my bed I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Very similar to Ezekiel 31, when God is describing Egypt, you know, as a tall tree as well. I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, someone who stays awake, you know, a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, with a loud voice. Cut it off! Chop down the tree! Cut off its branches! Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers. In other words, it's given and it cannot be changed. And the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High God, or the Most High, rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare its interpretation, since all the wise men in my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So he lays down the gauntlet for Daniel here and says, no, these guys can't interpret it. I'm giving it to you because you have the spirit of the holy gods in you. Here it is. I give you the interpretation. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time. Some of the older versions in the Arabic and the Persian versions have, I was astonished for an hour. Like he was astonished for an hour. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar has given him the dream, and he's there, maybe with the beard going, And he's pondering and thinking about it. And probably thinking about the implications of this dream and giving it to Nebuchadnezzar, especially if it was about him, because people have had their heads chopped off for lesser things than telling a prophecy against him and about him that he was about to be chopped down. So